Hey everybody, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. This episode's a little different because I have very specific memories of this actually happening. It's one of my earliest memories and I love them, even though I was sick as could be when they were occurring. It's July 20th, 1969. I am 4 years old, sitting in the living room of our family's mobile home in Perryville, Missouri. I have the measles and I have the mumps at the same time, which is exactly as miserable as it sounds. It's a hot summer day with no air conditioning, windows open, fans pushing warm air from one side of the room to the other. My mom has made me white bread with cheese sauce because it's the only thing soft enough to eat when your whole face hurts. I'm sitting in front of our black and white television, and I don't fully understand what I'm watching. I'm 4. But I know my mom isn't changing the channel, and that means it matters. And honestly, I could tell what was happening was pretty cool. We were watching an actual space rocket land on the moon. That little white circle in the sky most nights. What I didn't know, sitting there in the heat with my cheese sauce, was that more than 530 million other people around the world were watching the same transmission at the same moment. The largest television audience in history to that point. And I didn't know that the country responsible for what was on that screen had already begun cutting the budget that made it possible. So what does it cost in money and national identity to aim an entire country at a single moment in space and hold it there for 8 years until the moment arrives? What happens to the most expensive machine ever built the morning after it does the only thing it was designed to do? And what does all of that tell us about July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong later that night stepped off a ladder and onto the surface of the moon, and the most powerful, goal-based funding engine in American history achieved exactly what it set out to do and had to figure out almost immediately what was next. From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain the stories that changed business forever. Every date on the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, July 20th, that story takes us to 1969. One small step. Let's go back a couple years. On May 25th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress in Washington, D.C., and committed the country to a single sentence. I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Now, by that point in time, the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik 4 years earlier and had put the first human being in space just 6 weeks before Kennedy's address. And the gap in achievement had become something the country could no longer ignore. This was not purely a science program. It was a statement about who America was. A year later, at Rice University in Houston, Texas, Kennedy made the identity argument explicit with one of his most famous quotes. "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." That sentence became the organizing principle for one of the largest sustained investments in American history. Between 1961 and 1973, the United States spent roughly $25.8 billion on Project Apollo. That's approximately $338 billion in today's money. At its peak in 1966, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, consumed more than 4% of the entire federal budget, a level of investment that had nothing to do with the science of lunar geology and everything to do with who America intended to be in the world. Kennedy understood something important about how funding actually works. the most powerful engine isn't a business cause. It's a story. The money followed the narrative, and the narrative was about national identity at the height of the Cold War, which made it extraordinarily powerful and, as it turned out, extraordinarily fragile. That fragility was already visible before Apollo 11 launched. NASA's budget peaked in 1966, 3 years before the landing, because that's when the hardware was being built and the story was at its most urgent. By the summer of 1969, funding had already been declining for 3 years. The goal was nearly in reach, and the engine that had driven everything was already beginning to wind down. At 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong descended the ladder of the lunar module Eagle, stepped onto the surface of the Sea of Tranquility, and said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." As I mentioned, more than 530 million people watched it happen. The goal Kennedy had set 8 years earlier was now complete. Richard Nixon, who was now President of the United States, called it the greatest week in the history of the world since the creation. And from the Oval Office, he reached Armstrong and Aldrin by telephone to tell them, "For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one." Within 4 months, the New York Times was writing about Apollo 12 in terms of national anticlimax, calling the drop in public enthusiasm perhaps predictable considering the intense national emotion spent on the first moon landing. The same identity that had powered 8 years of investment turned out to be a one-time transaction, and without the narrative, the funding had no story left to follow. The federal budget confirmed it quickly. Nixon's White House submitted a NASA funding request of $3.33 billion for the fiscal year 1971, down sharply from the program's peak of more than $5 billion. Apollo 20 was canceled in January 1970, so its Saturn V rocket could be repurposed for Skylab, NASA's experimental orbital space station. Apollo 18 and 19 followed, 3 moon missions cut not because they would have failed, but because the story that justified them had run its course. Nixon chartered a space task group to define the next decade of human spaceflight. The proposals included Mars missions, orbital stations, and lunar bases. Nixon looked at the price tags, looked at Vietnam, looked at a country that had moved on, and declined to act. The engine had no destination, and without a destination, it had no argument for its own survival. In 1973, NASA submitted its annual budget to Congress, and the Apollo section contained a single sentence: "The planned objectives of the Apollo program have been accomplished. Fiscal year 1974 funding is not required." 12 words to close out 8 years, 6 lunar landings, and $338 billion in today's money. That sentence is one of the most clarifying statements in the history of institutional funding. Goal-based funding is the most powerful tool ever invented for achieving a defined outcome. Kennedy gave NASA a sentence, and NASA built the most complex machinery in human history around it. The sentence worked, the machine delivered, and then the sentence was finished. The pattern shows up well beyond NASA, in companies, campaigns, and movements of every kind. Define the goal narrowly enough to be urgent, achieve it, and the engine stops because it was built around the goal and not around what comes after. Define it broadly enough to sustain, and you lose the urgency that makes funding flow in the first place. NASA lived both sides of that trade-off inside a single decade, and the budget charts show exactly where the seam is. In 2026, right now, the United States is working to return humans to the moon under NASA's Artemis program, and the framing is different this time. The argument isn't about the American identity. It's about infrastructure, permanent presence on and around the moon, resource extraction, commercial partnerships, and strategic positioning against China's own lunar ambitions in ways that echo Cold War logic without quite repeating it. The goal this time isn't to plant a flag and prove something about ourselves. The goal is to stay and build something that outlasts the moment that created it. That is a more durable funding argument, because infrastructure doesn't end the way a race does. It took 60 years to find a real answer to the question Nixon couldn't resolve in 1970. Not another finish line, but a reason to keep going. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to actually understand business better without the fluff or the buzzwords or the MBA language, start by visiting us at businessdailypodcast.com.